So let's stay with the story. There's been mixed reaction to the decision by the Correctional Services Department to issue a notice of termination to G4S. Ruth Hopkins is no stranger to the show and has been following the Mangaung Correctional Centre story for over a decade now. She's an investigative journalist and author of The Misery Merchants. Ruth, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. In fact, let's start with this. Happy World Press Freedom Day. Your reflections on this day before we get into G4S.
Yeah, I think especially in a sector such as the private security sector, journalists are needed because there's very little accountability where multinationals become responsible for law and order. So I think journalists really have a very important role to play in general, but also in this sector.
Definitely. Now let's go to this particular story. I'm sure you saw it yesterday, and I'm keen to hear what are your thoughts on this one. I mean, the notice of termination, of course, 90 days, 8 to 9 days now, because this was yesterday, so that we understand, of course, whether or not this matter will end up in the courts or not. But what was your reaction when you read that statement?
Well, really good news, to be honest. I mean, I first broke the story 10 years ago in 2013 and reported on how inmates were being electroshocked, forcibly injected with antipsychotic drugs, beaten up, murdered even. And that story then went international, and then the minister responded, said the privatization of prisons has failed, we're going to investigate, we're going to take over the prison. And I, at the time, 10 years ago, thought accountability, they're going to terminate the contract. And that then didn't happen. The minister disappeared, and just a big cover-up happened, and the company was never held accountable. And DCS returned control of the prison back to G4S after 10 months without an explanation. And so now it happened all over again for a second time. And I was really waiting for the government to terminate the contract, because that is step number one in accountability that has to happen. So I'm glad, I'm happy.
And there's something I'd like, you to listen to, because you've taken us back to 2013. Yesterday, I was in conversation with the Correctional Services Commissioner, and he, I asked him what was the difference between what happened in 2013 and what we are seeing right now. I know there's a notice of termination now, but when the department swoops in, what is going to become different? So let's listen to what he has to say. I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
What is different this time around is that we firstly started with a temporary takeover by installing a temporary manager. And secondly, we sought a legal opinion. But also, in addition to that, if you go back to the Thabo Bester saga, you will realize that the reasons that the department is actually advancing for making this type of a decision are solid, and we are confident that we have reasonable prospects before the courts if we are to enter into that space with G4S or BCC. The legal challenge that we are currently managing with G4S has to do with the costs related to the takeover in 2013. So it is not that G4S is questioning the takeover. They are basically saying that the cost of the takeover should be borne by the Department of Correctional Services. Now, that is different. Now, in this instance, what we are going to do is to terminate the contract, obviously after the notice of 90 days, and we take over, meaning that there will not be monies paid to G4S for managing the institution anymore. The department will manage the institution and take all the costs.
Your response?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but one of them is, I would say, the reason to take over the prison the first time in 2013 was much more serious, in my view at least, than now, because now it's a single incident of one man, scamming and bribing and escaping from this prison. But at the time, I uncovered, and the department actually corroborated it in their investigation report, widespread use of electroshocking, people who'd been tortured to death, people were getting forcibly injected with antipsychotic drugs. It was much more systemic. So that's first and foremost one thing. And then he also mentioned that who's gonna pay for the cost of the takeover. And I believe DCS and G4S are in court, or were in court, because the first takeover, BCC challenged the fact that their payments stopped, and the judge initially ruled in their favor and said that they should be continued to receive payments. And fact of the matter is that this is an extremely expensive contract involving billions of rands. And it's the terms of the contract are very unfavorable towards the government. So termination of contract is again extremely expensive and will lead to crippling debts. And the terms of the contract are very much drafted in favor of the shareholders.
And it's going to, really be interesting even post that process to see how the prison is then run. Especially when one watches the documentary that you did, it boggles the mind as to the torture that people went through. Why were they allowed to even go through that? So thank you so much for your time, Ruth. Do appreciate it. Let's see then what happens with this one. That's Ruth Hopkins. She's an investigative journalist and an author of The Misery Merchants.